Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into how anti-Zionism is the new Nazism. Let's get started.
Der Führer empfing den Großmufti von Jerusalem, einen der einflussreichsten Männer des arabischen Nationalismus. Der Großmufti ist das religiöse Oberhaupt der Araber in Palästina und gleichzeitig deren oberster Richter und Finanzverwalter.
For my very astute listeners, you may have heard that voice before. That is the voice of Nazi propaganda. The video you just listened to, in German, was a proud proclamation documenting the Arab leader of what was then known as British Palestine, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who is coming proudly to Germany to work with the Germans, to speak with Hitler himself and Hitler's people in order to bring the Nazi genocide of the Jews to British Palestine. But you might be asking, wait a minute, what does British Mandate of Palestine have to do with the Germans? And I thought, from reading all of the comments on social media, that the Jews are the Nazis and the Palestinian Arabs are the good guys? How is it that the Palestinian Arabs were literally working with the Nazis? In keeping up with our recent tradition of debunking false claims made by the other side, this episode is going to be focusing on the debunked claim that the Zionists are the Nazis. I am sure for most of my listeners, anybody who's Jewish at least, they have received comments on social media, something about them being a Zio-Nazi, them committing a Holocaust in Gaza, so many different ways of trying to connect the Jews to the Nazis, which is kind of ironic considering what you just heard, which was the fact that the quote-unquote Palestinian Arabs, who weren't really Palestinian Arabs at the time, literally worked with the Nazis. But in order to understand how we got to where we were in 1941, when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem showed up in Berlin to meet with Hitler and Nazi officials, we have to go back a little bit to understand how we got there. I know that most of our listeners probably have a good grasp of what happened in the Middle East around the time of the 1900s, and those of you who might be a little less familiar with the situation, you can go back and listen to some of our older episodes. But just generally speaking, we all know that the Ottoman Empire, known at the time as the sick man of Europe, because the empire was crumbling, decided to ally itself with Germany and the Central Powers against the Allies. And considering we all know how World War I ended, it didn't go well for the Germans or the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and the victors of World War I took control of their land. This is how the British got the British Mandate of Palestine. In World War I, when it ended, they were given the land to be a mandate while they created the Jewish state. At the time, British Mandate of Palestine was run by a commissioner named Herbert Samuel, a British Jewish person who was in charge of the whole region in order to make sure that the transition away from being a mandate into a country would be successful. As a way of reaching out his hand to the Arabs of the region, he decided to install a figurehead for the Arab population in order to coordinate and collaborate on ideas they had for the future. He needed somewhat of a middleman between the people and himself to know what is needed and how to improve the lives of everybody in the region. He went out looking through the Arab population to find someone he could work with in order to coordinate and collaborate between himself, the British, and the Arab population of the land. And there were a few options, tribal leaders from the time, but he settled on Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, someone who claimed at the time to be somewhat of a moderate, open for the idea of living side by side with the Jews. And in 1921, Herbert Samuel appointed him as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and put him on the Supreme Muslim Council. Unfortunately for Samuel, Husseini either lied or changed his mind and was absolutely not at all in favor of Jews being in the land and actively worked to rally his people against the Jewish population, calling for multiple pogroms like the Hebron massacre, multiple Jaffa riots against Jews and others, and it was really a thorn in the side of the British. Husseini might be personally responsible for the 1939 British White Paper that banned all Jews from immigrating to the land of Israel. Clearly, Herbert Samuel made a massive mistake in installing this man as some type of leader over the Arabs, riling them up, turning them on their Jewish neighbors, and continuously being a thorn in the side of the British Empire. It wasn't too long until the British got annoyed with him and actually kicked him off of the Supreme Council, and he fled to Lebanon, which at that point was under French control. At this point, we're getting to around the time of World War II, when the Nazis are coming to power in Germany at the end of the 1930s, and al-Husseini, living in Lebanon, made contact with Germans that he thought he might have something in common with. There was no denying the fact that the Nazis were incredibly anti-Jewish, and therefore they had a lot in common with Husseini, who also disliked the Jews and wanted them out of the Arab world. And so al-Husseini makes his way to Italy and then to Germany, and by the 1940s, he is sitting down with Hitler as a representative of the Arabs of the Middle East and someone who is virulently anti-British and wanted the British and the Jews out of British Mandate of Palestine, or more accurately, the entire Middle East, which he felt shouldn't be controlled by any of these British or French colonizers. And this is how we get to the meeting we heard in the beginning of this podcast. Husseini, who is on the run from the British now that he has caused so much trouble for them and actually ended up having a bounty on his head of £20,000, ends up fleeing to Germany and promising his devotion to the Nazis and their cause, with the understanding that once they finish with the Jews of Europe, they would come down to the Middle East and finish the Jews there too, thus giving him the ability to take over that land and be the leader of the Arab state. And if you think I'm just making this up, as most trolls do when you talk to them online who have never heard this before, go quickly and you can Google al-Husseini tours death camp. Al-Husseini hangs out with Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, and of course the picture of al-Husseini with Hitler himself. Much like Arab colonization, which is a thing that definitely happened but no one likes to talk about, not a lot of people like to talk about the connection between the Arab world and Hitler. But sadly for them, it clearly happened, because al-Husseini, while in Berlin, living in exile, had a very important role in the Nazi movement. He was essentially chief propagandist for the Nazis to the Arab world. He ensured German propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, was spread across the British Mandate of Palestine and the entire Arab world as a whole. And al-Husseini didn't just stop at propaganda. He then went to try and recruit Muslim people into the Nazi units, and he was very successful. There are pictures of him inspecting his Muslim Nazi units, some from the Arab world, but many from the Balkans, places like Bosnia, that is filled with Muslim people who they got on the side of the Nazis and fought in the Waffen-SS. Knowing this, all of this history that is as clear as day, there's documentation that proves this, it is amazing to me that people will sit here and say that the Arabs were not the Nazis, or the Arabs today that continue al-Husseini's ideology and propaganda are not connected in any way to the Nazis, considering they literally were born out of the Nazi movement. They essentially are the living incarnation of the Nazi movement that didn't die. The German part died, but it lived alive and well within Arab world thanks to the work of al-Husseini, which continued following World War II, when he fled to Egypt and then Lebanon, undoubtedly spreading the Nazi propaganda that he had spread for most of his life, until the 1970s when he passed away in Beirut. It seems pretty clear to anybody who's looking who the Nazi is in this situation. However, people are still calling the Jews the Nazis, and amazingly, there's even a talking point to counter this factual information, and I've heard it many times online. Anytime you bring up the collaboration between the Arabs and the Nazis, thus proving a direct connection, inevitably you will get from them the Havara Agreement of the 1930s. This is their go-to to say, see, the Jews were actually working with the Nazis. What about the Havara Agreement? So I will preempt this completely BS talking point now for you if you ever get this talking point. In 1933, when Hitler comes to power officially, he seizes power, The Jewish world, and frankly the world in general, already knows what Hitler wants to do. He's been very clear as he's been talking openly and publicly about his hatred of Jews. And the Jewish people of British Palestine, or Israel, attempted to make a deal with the Nazis that if you don't want Jews in your country, why not allow us to take them in the British Mandate of Palestine? This wasn't an unusual idea by the people of British Mandate of Palestine, because a few years later, the entire world got together in the Evian Conference of 1938 to decide what to do with the Jews that Hitler essentially wanted to kick out of his country. The world also saw that Hitler didn't want his Jews and were looking for a way to get these Jewish people out of Europe as quickly and easily as possible. Sadly, none of them wanted any of the Jews, and at this point, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is pressuring the British to not allow a single person into the land of Israel, thus making this agreement impossible. So the irony, of course, is the fact that people are saying that the Zionists were collaborating with Hitler, when ironically, the Grand Mufti, who literally was collaborating with Hitler, ensured that the Havara Agreement would never actually work because the British wouldn't allow these Jews into the British Mandate of Palestine. So anytime someone tries to suggest that the Jewish people were collaborating with the Nazis, you can debunk it pretty much right away. It's completely ridiculous. There was an attempt to save Jewish lives, as there was by every country in the entire world, but the people who literally collaborated with the Nazis were the Arabs. So if we can see that historically speaking, the Arabs were the one who were collaborating with the Nazis and kept Nazi ideology and brought it back to the British Mandate of Palestine, how is it that we ended up with the Jews becoming the Nazis and the Arabs being the Jews in this weird inverted situation? And the answer to this is anti-Semitism. I know, everyone's going to say that Jews always claim everything is anti-Semitism, it's behind everything. But hear me out. According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the official definition of anti-Semitism is as follows. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards those Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jews or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. There are a number of specific things listed. I won't go through them all, but one that really sticks out, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policies to that of the Nazis, also known as Holocaust inversion. This is something that is so prevalent in anti-Semitism these days that they added it to the definition of anti-Semitism to invert the Holocaust, to blame the Jews for what happened to the Jews and say that they are now doing it to somebody else. The word Holocaust literally is only describing the actions against the Jews of World War II. Just for the record, the Holocaust does not include the people who are disabled, the Poles, Gypsies, and Roma. These people are not technically part of the Holocaust. They were genocided, don't get me wrong. But the Holocaust is specifically the systematic murder of Jewish people during the World War II era, and therefore cannot and should never be used to describe anything else. So the Arabs today purposefully using that term in order to describe Gaza isn't a mistake. They are inverting the Holocaust on purpose because they are, in fact, being anti-Semitic. People who call it a, quote, genocide, which is not true, are at least more factually accurate to the terminology they should be using. A genocide is a generic idea of murdering a lot of people with intent and all of that. The Holocaust specifically is only about Jews, and to use that term is not an accident. In the end, I know that many of you have probably seen the comments calling every Jewish person or every Zionist a Zio-Nazi, or saying that we are committing a Holocaust. This Holocaust inversion is rampant on the other side of the argument. But understand what they are trying to do here. First of all, and most importantly, they are trying to whitewash their own history of actively working with the Nazis in order to murder Jews in their land. And they did it during the 1929 Hebron massacre and the Jaffa riots and so many more. They were actively acting on their plan to do what the Nazis were doing. They just didn't do it systematically. They didn't have the power. I'm sure if the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem would have had the opportunity to bring the Nazis to British Mandate of Palestine, they happily would have created ghettos and death camps and murdered just as many of their Jews there. It is not an accident that these two groups of people worked together at this time, because what the Arabs of the Middle East, especially British Mandate of Palestine, wanted was the same thing as what the Nazis wanted. They were one and the same. They were working together towards the same goal: the destruction of the Jewish people across the entire world. They both virulently hated the Jewish people, and ironically, both blamed the Jews for all of their world's problems. The Nazis loved to blame the Jews for everything wrong in their society. The Arabs also blamed the Jews for all of their problems in their society. And it is also not an accident that today, when soldiers go into Gaza and fight, they find pictures and books and materials related to Nazism, literal Nazism. We're not talking just the typical propaganda hate pictures. We're talking pictures of Hitler in people's houses. Arab copies of Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, which remains a bestseller in the Arab world today. And of course, we can never forget the people in the Western world, the useful idiots, who happily say Heil Hitler, Hitler was right, Hitler should have finished the job, or proudly show pictures of Hitler or the swastika at their rallies. They don't even hide the fact that they support Hitler and that they wish Hitler would finish the job, just like al-Husseini. It is so unbelievably laughable at the fact that anybody with a straight face can sit here and say that the Jews are the new Nazis when the current people who are protesting against the Jews are openly supporting Nazi symbols and saying, we agree with the Nazis. In a somewhat recent interaction with someone online in the comments section, I thought it was so funny to see this specific thing in action. In a post that I made comparing the Nazis to the anti-Israel crowds, some Western useful idiot decided to tell me that it was a very insensitive comparison. He very adamantly said that the protesters out there being anti-Zionist are absolutely not the Nazis, and that the Jews are the Nazis. And only a few minutes later, an Arab comes into the comment section and says, I'm with Hitler. He knew the Jews better, and that's why he did a Holocaust. Free Palestine. And my response to this person was, you can go talk to your other friend over here, and I tagged them, who says that you guys aren't the Nazis. Sounds pretty clear that you're happy with that comparison. It is pretty clear on the internet, on the streets of the West, and historically speaking in the Middle East, the people who are anti-Zionist were always pro-Nazi. Nothing has changed from the 1920s until today. Anti-Zionism is indeed, and in fact, the new and the original Nazism. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.